how is it in clinical work that hallucinatory voices might eventually become more benign? And that of course, is something you discuss a little bit in the book. But maybe just to ask a basic, even more rudimentary question, not only how is it that voices of that sort might become more benign, but why should it be that some of those voices, not necessarily all of them, would be disturbing and might have homicidal or frightening or negative imperatives or commands? Now, I suppose partly the answer you've already given is that sometimes this would be a kind of unconscious impulse which is now being expressed in a very direct form. But just maybe what are your thoughts on those two? And also just to qualify that, to hear a voice doesn't necessarily mean it would be saying do something bad or something frightening necessarily. So just to emphasize that. But how would we respond to those two ideas? Like, number one, why is it that sometimes they are frightening in what they're asking one to do? And let's also just note that they could be frightening in form as well as in content, right? But back to the question, why is it that maybe the more memorable ones that we seem to speak about are those that are kind of a bit disturbing in content, number one? And number two, for the clinician, what might be the processes that help such hallucinatory voices become more manageable, more benign?
Yeah. So at that point, I think we should return to Lacan's idea of allusion. So he said that a hallucination is alluding to something. And that's, I think, the question that we should ask as clinicians: what are these voices, what are these experiences alluding to? And of course, when there is something of a violent communication that is being directed to a person through a psychotic experience, it at least most probably means that the person has been confronted with threatening situations, with situations that tend to kind of be so overwhelming that they tend to disappear as an autonomous individual, as someone who is there in the situation. So I think that when the voice is threatening, it often means that the situations they have been confronted with, like specifically, or maybe like current situations that associatively are linked to earlier threatening situations. It's not always like a current threat, but often like something that associatively makes links with something that was very threatening to a person. That's always the question. So if there is a hallucination of that kind, at the level of content or in the way indeed the hallucination is organized, the question is always, but what is the basic challenge? And I think that that of course, as an analyst, we should do the work with them. Yeah? So trying to reconstruct, and that does not mean that we have to interpret everything, and but rather like we have to build a hypothesis. Because that's what we do when we listen. We build hypotheses about what the person might be living through and why it is connected in a certain organization. So we discern a certain logic in people's functioning. And if we see certain logic, we can do two things. We can, on the one hand, try to think about how to delimit something of that painful confrontation. Mm-hmm. And so often this will happen by talking with people about their lives. And then we have to start from our hypothesis as clinicians as to how the psychotic experience is linked to something of a real challenge a person has been confronted with. And then, of course, it's, for example, by trying to talk about the real threat. Maybe that could, like in one case, be like acting as a father in relation to your children, or being a partner, or I don't know what. It's very diverse, but often it's by talking then about these very like down-to-earth questions and topics and difficulties, like managing your role in your job context. Sometimes we will discuss these things with people because we have the hypothesis that, logically speaking, something of a threatening situation is there that is causing the psychotic experience. And then we do not like literally address the psychotic experience or the content of the psychotic experience, but rather try to like be in touch with the dynamical source of it. what was causing it, logically speaking, that psychotic experience. And that's one thing that as a clinician we can do. And I think that's very straightforward often what we can do there. And that's something that we can actually do. We shouldn't be too afraid of talking with people about these kind of challenges. And then in a second moment, which is something that, especially from a Lacanian perspective, is not often stressed, but I do think it's possible. When people leave acute psychotic episodes in their lives, it is often possible for them to return to the psychotic experience and to kind of read the strangeness of what was happening to them, like what the voices were communicating, or what they tended to take as a truth in a hallucination, in a delusion, and to kind of situate it, because often people do have an interest in that. And sometimes analysts and other mental health care workers are afraid of opening that dialogue because they are afraid that when we start talking about it, they will destabilize again and we will end up in psychosis again. But that's not my experience. I think that if we do it in a communicative way, like not challenging with silences too much, but by staying in touch with people and trying to decipher and having ideas about what it might express, but gently, not confrontationally, but gently in terms of what the persons are also thinking of. It might be possible for them to kind of reconstruct something about the psychotic experience and what it might have been echoing about the struggles in their lives. And particularly important for it, about it, is that it often helps people to kind of like find some peace in the fact that they have had the disruptive psychotic experience, because for many people who have had psychotic experiences, it is kind of confrontational. It does create kind of something of a contrast in your self-experience, because on the one hand you have been this, and on the other hand you're another person, and it's kind of something of a split. And I think that, psychologically speaking, there is no, well, there, of course, we are all split as subjects, but like the black and white division is something artificial, meaning like there is something of a communication that is possible. And it's not that we will be able to interpret everything or make sense of everything that has happened during a psychotic episode, but there is a link. And that link, we can discuss it with people. And I think that's clinically speaking, the two most important things we can do, like discerning the logic and starting from the logic, questioning what is the real issue in, of course, like very specific daily life situations and how these are associatively linked with former situations that were difficult. That's something we can discuss. And on the other hand, like what has been communicated, and can we read something from that communication?
You know, that reminds me also of, I think, one of the really powerful and optimistic, actually, conclusions of your book is when you give us a series of descriptions from art, from the literature, and from clinical practice of how someone who's experienced psychosis finds a way in a change in their lifestyle through a production, through the making of something. Often the materiality of it seems to be important, whereby it's not a case that a series of psychotic symptoms, to refer to that language, is kind of simply removed through maybe some kind of, medical, whatever, psychiatric regime of prescription and so on and so forth, but finds a way of living where these things aren't all taken away, but whereby certain ideas that may seem more eccentric are part of how one fashions a life.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really important if you could just share one or two of those. I know, I mean, I have some that I'm particularly drawn to, but let's see which ones you can provide, just because, and just to state the obvious point, I mean, I think we've assumed this in our conversation, but just to note that maybe not everyone would know this reference point, but the famous point in Freud is to say, just bear in mind, a delusion is not necessarily pathological. A delusion
Yeah.
is, in a sense, a way of responding to a kind of crisis. A delusion is already a kind of repair work. But
Yeah.
any examples that you would give? Because I think, sometimes, particularly beginning a clinical career, to be confronted with psychotic symptoms can be a little, intimidating. But what's so important about what your examples are is that it's not the case, sorry to be a bit repetitive about it, that one would necessarily aim to remove all apparent symptoms of a
Yeah.
psychosis.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe you could give us an example, or more than one, that you found helpful, both in guiding
Yeah.
your work and in communicating some of these ideas.
Yeah. So I think that one of the basic works that needs to be done in also the treatment of psychosis is that people should, well, have to find a way in dealing with the associativeness in themselves. Because this is what happens in psychosis. Like there is an over-associativeness with elements around you. When we're discussing delusions, I mentioned like you're driving your car, there's a red car next to you, and then the red starts to signify something. Maybe it reminds you of blood, and it makes you fear that someone will be killed. So there is a certain kind of associativeness that is kind of proper to psychosis. And people who are vulnerable to this kind of experiences often shy away from it because there is the danger that if you follow it, you will end up in manifest psychosis again. So when you're not manifestly psychotic, but you feel the tendency in yourselves, well, how to find a certain peace in living with that? That's a challenge for people. And therefore, I do think that creative action is very interesting because creativity is exactly that. It's not following the main narrative around something. It's taking an object and not doing with that very specific object what people usually do with the object. It's doing something different with it. Like Duchamp's art, for example, he takes a urinoir and puts it in a different way and adds a little sentence, and then it's something else that he does with that object. He takes it out of the ordinary and does something, a little manipulation on it, and then it becomes something of a surprise. And then maybe we can find it fascinating or we can find it ridicule. Doesn't matter, but it's something of a little manipulation. But Duchamp was only able to do that because he kind of trusted his associative intuition. And I do think that people with that vulnerability towards psychosis can embrace it and not just deny it themselves, but kind of listen to it and maybe use it as a source for creativity within of course, taking into account their specific style, because some people are well tempted to write and to do or to play music or to paint or to work in the garden. I don't know what, but there is something of the associativeness that you can take with you and to create something, and maybe what you're then creating is expressing something of what and who you are. And what is being created is not only like meaningful in the sense like I do know the meaning of what I'm doing, but it's just creative. And all creative acts are in a certain sense also a bit nonsensical. And that's something that I find that the psychoanalyst Annie Rogers, who herself has had psychotic episodes in her life, describes so very well. She kind of says, like, on the one hand, I dealt with my psychotic episodes through therapy, and therapy helped me to kind of situate these in terms of my life and to kind of overcome and work through some of these contents and experiences. But on the other hand, I do observe in myself this little bout of associativeness, of maybe absurdity. And she kind of describes in her work how she works with it, like through creative work, like with photography and graphic work, and like playing with words in a certain sense, on not the playing with words as it might happen in a schizophrenic episode, but playing with words like we do in poetry. And then she describes it like I learned to trust that dimension in myself and to kind of work with it and to give it a place and a space in my life. And therefore, like, and of course, in the book, I refer to other people like Carl Gustav Jung, is also, when I read his work, for me, he has also had psychotic revelations the moment he had this conflict with Sigmund Freud, and the moment he was suddenly isolated and losing like a meaningful connection with Freud. He had all these kind of weird experiences, but Jung, I don't think Jung like became manifestly psychotic because of it. Jung, on the one hand, started painting, started making like, yeah, like painting and writing in a certain style, the things that were being revealed to him uh, in a somewhat like paranormal or parapsychological ways, things were being revealed to him, but he kept it together. He wrote it down, maybe in a bit of an automatic way. But he created a certain aesthetic around it, and he compiled it in a book with which is a bit like a medieval book, a thick leather volume, and there you see these paintings and writings. And Jung kind of describes how he built a psychological theory starting from it, but on the other hand, also cultivating a certain aesthetic and a certain spirituality in life that was also in line with what he had been experiencing. And so I think that, well, people like Jung and Andy Rogers, but as many others I refer to, like, are inspirational both for people struggling with psychosis, but also for therapists to see like there is this possibility. And so as a therapist, we have like this as the potential thing that we could try to realize with our patients. Just like for a patient, it's something of, okay, of a hope that opens up, that maybe you cannot, or maybe there is this possibility of not just being the victim of what is overcoming you. Maybe you can try to look for a more active, agentic way of dealing with this kind of tendency in yourselves. And so, and that creativity, you could say, is exactly very interesting for a society where we have lots of disruptive events or lots of repetitions of the same, and something of a creative, out of the box looking at things is exactly what is needed to have a lively society. So therefore, in my opinion, psychosis is what keeps society innovative, because something of innovation comes from this out of the box experiences that people have.
I mean, the examples are very, very striking, and I think they're also very helpful in thinking about what can be done in a supportive role in clinical work. I mean, just to quickly note, I mean, some of them, there's an example of an architect who does kind of a whole architectural thing with a house, an innovative new way of putting together these spaces. I mean, you mentioned the example of Jung. There's many others, but for me, what's interesting about them, and I suppose to a Lacanian ear, is they involve a clear element of materiality in many instances, but they also involve a symbolic element, a way of putting together and making sense of difficult things, even if the way of doing that seems somewhat eccentric, right? It's a way of making a little kind of symbolic framework to process, to make sense of difficult things. And also, of course, that element of some kind of libidinal investment, some kind of enjoyment in what one is putting together. I mean, we could speak about that, but I would just recommend looking at Stijn's book for more of that. We should end, but maybe just one last question. It's linked to a very striking and nice example at the beginning of the book, but it seems to be so important ever since Freud says, well, we cannot work psychoanalytically with someone who has dementia praecox because the transference is not possible. You could say that a huge number of publications and effort in the Lacanian field has been precisely to say one can quite clearly work in a psychoanalytic way with people with psychosis, but we need to think somewhat differently about the transference. And just because that's a big issue, and I know you've got many thoughts on it, but could you give us some input on that? What is the kind of transference that one strives for? What is the position that the analyst would attempt to assume in viable and effective clinical work with psychosis?
Yeah, I think for me, the key word is encounter. We should try to encounter, to create an encounter, which is on the one hand difficult because it often seems like that people who are having psychotic experiences are locked in their own universe. And on the other hand, they don't seem to believe what the therapist is offering, or they don't seem to see potentiality in what the therapist is offering because they have the feeling like that it's so distant from what they are living through. So therefore, in the Freudian sense, you could say there is a difficulty to have spontaneously something of a transference. And the danger that Lacan was also pointing to, that if we would have too much presupposed knowledge that we introduce in as a therapist in a therapy situation, or if we have too many like intentions to do the good with people, we tend to be threatening. We tend to provoke like a delusional experience for people in relation to us as therapists. And so what is the solution? Well, as I said, it's an encounter, but an encounter that should start actually from a not knowing, and not not knowing and not having too many intentions, but at the same time being there not as an ego, not as a source of knowledge, not as an expert, but rather as someone who is marked by lack. I would say, like in Lacanian terminology, as a castrated other. And so that means that our little failures, our little strange ways of behaving, these are often like the point that makes a clinician accessible for a patient. And of course, I can here refer to Mario, my work with Mario. I was a young clinician. I was trying to do good. I was also seeing myself that I was a young clinical psychologist and I wanted to be professional, meaning that I had lots of ideas about myself as an ego. But the moment the click really occurred in working with Mario was actually when one day I was going to his house, because these were house consultations, because Mario locked himself up in a room and didn't want to leave anymore. But one day I was leaving my car and it was raining and I was hurrying, and we wanted to reach the front door of the house and to ring. But then suddenly I just fell down. I fell down on the ground because it was a little slippery on outside, and I didn't take notice of it, and I fell down. And for Mario had seen that, me lying on the ground and cursing like, oh, what happened? What's happening? He came down and he opened the door and he shouted for everybody like that I had fallen down. And then for me, I kind of intuitively understood that it was very important for him that I was there as like the one with the lack, the wounded, not very handy person who was also struggling, who was a joke rather than a serious person, because he can't even leave his car in a decent way. So, and that opened something of a possibility. I fell down from the important place where I had put myself, and especially that created the possibility of interacting. And that's often what is needed to have a real encounter. It's not with our egos and our importance and our titles, and our fancy clinics and our fancy practices, but more like being there as someone who is marked by a lack, not taking himself always that seriously. So these are the important things to create a connection.
Great, Stijn. Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. So thanks for your time. It's been wonderful to discuss your book.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Derek.